Hi, I'm Mark Warwall for Highbrow Magazine, and I've got a story for you. I ambled up to the merry day like an old salt, as if I had been shipping out on schooners like her from Valencia to Valparaiso. Actually, I didn't amble. I positively swaggered down the long dock. The only giveaway to my actual landlubber status were the rollerboard suitcase, instead of a sailor's duffel, and the iPhone in my hand as I asked myself, am I in the right place? The Merry Day is a landmark in Camden Harbor. Not just a beautiful boat, she's the oldest schooner to be purpose-built for passenger sailings. Schooners traditionally were used for fishing and hauling coastal freight, and only occasionally for passenger service. Launched in 1962, the ship has just enough scars to show her age, but not too many to give a nervous passenger pause. Nonetheless, right away as I stood at the hull of the ship, I was apprehensive. I'm at an age where my doctor told me to stay off ladders. I get the same advice from my wife, my friends, and the lady who cuts my hair. So naturally, to board the beautiful schooner, I was faced with, you guessed it, a ladder. I heaved my suitcase up to a welcoming deckhand and mounted the half-dozen rungs, threw my legs over the gunwales, and stood on the deck like I'd been sailing my whole life. Call me Ishmael. John, the crewman who greeted me, smiled and shook my hand, then ticked my name off a passenger list. Let me give you a tour, he said. First things first, John told me in no uncertain terms to take caution on the stairways, called companionways, leading below decks. The steps are only slightly less steep than the rungs of an average folding ladder. Be sure you go down them facing backwards, he said, the same direction you go up them. You don't want to fall. Trust me, I've fallen down every one of these stairs. He pointed out the Merry Day's two bathrooms, or heads, on the main deck. The two heads were meant for a crew and passenger complement of 35 max. I didn't like the sound of that, though I felt better when John told me they were cleaned 5 times a day. Still, I'd have to climb the nearly vertical stairs from my cabin if I needed to use the facilities overnight. And the flushing mechanism was unique. You had to lift up a pedal on the floor with your foot, which filled the commode with water, then step on the pedal to flush. Make sure you practice how to flush it, advised Miguel, a gastroenterologist and fellow passenger, so you don't have to learn how at 3 a.m. I had a concern, though, having nothing to do with the boat per se. The outdoor temperature on the water. It was late summer, and I assumed I'd be warm enough with long-sleeve shirts and a fleece vest. But only 30 minutes after boarding, while the Merry Day was still tied to the pier, I realized I'd need something warmer, especially for the evenings. I had forgotten one small detail. I was in Maine, where the locals worry about heat stroke when the thermometer hits 55 degrees. Back in town, our ship would remain docked that first evening, so I was in no rush. I found a sporting goods shop where I bought a hoodie. Across the front was emblazoned, Camden. It might as well have said, tourist. I put it on and walked back to the dock, where my fellow passengers were merciless. Forget to bring your jacket, did you? Smirked one. Hey, what town did you buy that in? Asked another facetiously. Pro tip. Dress slightly warmer than you think you'll need. Even in warm seasons, sailing can be chilly. Before sunset, the passengers were called on deck for a greeting from Captain Barry King, a licensed Coast Guard master. The crew simply called him Cap. Welcome aboard, he said. Glad to have you all here for 3 days of pleasure and possibly a few moments of terror. We'll see. Our group of 21 amateur sailors laughed politely, and a few of them looked uncertainly around the ropes and rigging of the Merry Day. So put your cell phones on airplane mode, Cap continued. Let's live in the moment. Unplug! Unplug for just a little bit. We don't often get a chance to do that these days, so let's pretend that it's 1995. Someone asked what our itinerary would be. Penobscot Bay, which lay before us just beyond the harbor, is dotted with scores of islands, and we had no clue which of them we'd be visiting. Itinerary? Exploded Cap in mock horror. No, there's no itinerary. I make this up by the seat of my pants. One thing we knew for sure, though, we were promised an onshore lobster bake the next evening, somewhere on one of those green bits of land in the distance. We just had to figure out which one. Our mate, the second in command, JP, asked everyone to remain for a safety briefing. Like the boat's 3 deckhands, JP worked the summer on the myriad and the winter at some other outdoor job, sailing a yacht down to Florida, being a mountain guide, or, in JP's case, earning his ski instructor license in Utah. I'm not averse to a glass of wine with dinner, or before or after dinner, or a beer in the afternoon, so I was curious about the words on alcohol on the schooner's website. Guests are welcome to bring their own grog, none is served on board, if they remember to drink in moderation. A large ice chest is provided for BYOB booze. I'd brought some beers and wine with me, but wondered if I'd find myself in the seagoing equivalent of a revival meeting, where a Sam Adams was sneered at and the mere sight of a cup of Cabernet was criticized. But when I opened the container where other guests had already stashed their bottles and cans, I discovered the ice chest of a college sophomore's wildest dreams. IPAs, strongbows, hard lemonade, bottle after bottle of Sauvignon Blanc and Chardonnay, and assorted other adult beverages. But make no mistake, this was no booze cruise. My fellow passengers adulted responsibly, even with a smutty-nosed brown ale in hand. The reason no one stashed their drinks in the refrigerators of their cabins was that there were no fridges in the cabins. There were no closets, there were no toilets, no writing desk, TV, coffee maker, or other common appurtenances of cruise ship cabins. Instead, there were bunk beds, a wall-mounted escape ladder to the main deck, and a sink the size of a small mixing bowl for brushing teeth and washing hands. Passengers wanting a shower could either put on a bathing suit and hose off on deck, or use the shower hose in one of the 2 heads, where everything got sprayed. We just ask that you put the plastic cover on the toilet paper roll to keep it dry, John told me during my initial ship tour. There's no getting around it. Sailing on a schooner is a bare-bones cruise. But to an extent, that's precisely why most guests sign on. Forget the art auctions, the boarding photographer, and the sad comic relief of the cruise director found on large cruise ships. Guests on a Maine schooner, if they wish, lend a hand to raise and lower the sails, learn how to tie knots, sing folk songs in the dining room adjacent to the galley, and simply grab a deck chair as the boat catches a fair breeze and heels to starboard, bound for the next island ahead. I knew almost none of this when I boarded the myriad on a mid-September afternoon, but I learned quickly the next morning when we pulled away from Camden and made for the farther reaches of Penobscot Bay. "Holloway Peak!" shouted JP. 10 passengers pulled with all their might on the ropes as deckhand Liam yanked down on the mainmast line. When the mainmast was tight, Liam yelled, "Hold!" "Holloway throat!" JP called to the other 10 passengers on the opposite side of the schooner. We were beginning to feel like seafarers already, and we were barely out of Camden Harbor. The commands kept coming. "Holloway! Hold the line! 2 steps forward! Drop the line!" By noon, we were jolly tars, infinitely pleased with our nautical knowledge and seagoing savvy. What I know about sailing, I learned from the Beach Boys song Sloop John B. I wouldn't know a boom from a forestay, a jib from a gaff. Thankfully, the amount of sailing knowledge necessary for a cruise on a windjammer like the myriad is 0. You can even man the helm with nary a scrap of seagoing skill. Cap will probably point out a spit of land in the distance and say, "Make for that island." Next thing you know, an entire schooner is under your control. "Dolphins!" someone shouted as soon as we'd set down our lines. A pair of the sleek water creatures skimmed along the surface to starboard, as if checking that we were doing everything correctly. JP shouted humorously, "Hold for dolphins!" Unexpectedly, just then, a juvenile bald eagle circled high on a wind drift off our port bow, between the Merry Day and a nearby islet stippled with mature balsam firs and beeches. White-sailed sloops and ketches in the distance looked like confetti spilled on the indigo waters of the bay. I'd been to Maine before, but now I felt like I was truly in Maine. Anyone who has sailed on a ship that holds fewer than, say, 30 passengers knows that mealtimes can best be described as homey affairs. Entrees are laid out in aluminum trays. Plastic cutlery is wrapped in a napkin or a paper towel. For breakfast on our first morning, we served ourselves scrambled eggs, sausages, muffins, orange juice, and tea or coffee. There was plenty of food, but if what you want is an omelet station, waffles with blueberry syrup and Ready Whip, and an array of meats and cheeses, buy a ticket on a Carnival cruise. For lunch that day, we marched into the below decks galley and got corn chowder, PB&J sandwiches, slices of mozzarella, and a green salad. And so it went over our long weekend aboard. Baked chicken and gravy with mashed potatoes, spaghetti and meatballs, pumpkin soup, pie or cake or fresh fruit for dessert. The meals were what I would call, in the best possible way, solid roadside diner food, comfort food. Gourmet cooking and midnight chocolate fountains happen somewhere else. For breakfast and lunch, the passengers would step down a steep stairway directly into the galley, complete with a wood-burning stove that troubled me more than the possibility of falling overboard. We'd pass into a small seating area where the buffet-style meals were laid out, and then either find a seat on deck or grab a tiny bit of table space and eat inside. Dinner was more formal. We took seats at 3 large tables next to the kitchen and were served our meals there. The exception to all of that, and a highlight of most Maine Windjammer cruises, was the beachside lobster bake on our first evening under sail. We made for a beach that Cap and the crew hadn't been to before. The crew headed in on rowboats to set everything up. When the passengers arrived 2 hours later, a pyramid of large lobsters roasted over a fire. Corn on the cob warmed on a grill. Hot dogs sweated over the heat of a barbecue, and salads were laid out on a table. The beach sand was still warm despite the early evening temperature. I'd never eaten lobster with my bare hands before. "Just crack it open," said Miguel, the doctor, "but be sure to crack it open away from yourself." Honestly, I chose a 3-night cruise rather than a longer one for fear of being bored. That turned out to be a meritless concern, thanks largely to the other guests. I've been on more than 40 cruises, from behemoth cruise ships to cozy luxury vessels. As a rule, the smaller the ship, the more interesting the passengers. Probably the enforced shipboard intimacy helps. On the Merry Day were a doctor, a fashion industry exec, small business owners, a married couple who were both engineers, and others from ages 35 to 80, successful and fascinating people who liked to talk and to listen. One day, we anchored off tiny Burnt Island with a hiking path that encircled it. I set off with 5 of my companions for what should have been a 30-minute hike. An hour later, we had no idea where we were or how to get back to the boat. How 6 college-educated people can get lost on a small island with a circular hiking path is still a mystery. But by the time we returned to the Merry Day, we were the best of friends. Raising and lowering the sails was always a group effort. Meals at 9, noon, and 6 regulated our days. Leisurely conversations on deck over glasses of wine filled much of the time, and taking the helm under Cap's watchful eye was always an option. After dinner on our last night down in the galley, deckhand Liam produced a guitar and began to sing folk songs. I had brought my mandolin for just such an occasion, and we were soon joined on guitar by Joel, the fashion exec. The other passengers crammed into the compact dining room with us and sang along. That night, I couldn't sleep. At around 4 a.m., I put on my pants, undershirt, 2 top shirts, and my Camden hoodie, basically every piece of clothing I had packed, and climbed the companionway up to the deck. The night sky was as dark as I had ever seen it. The bay waters lapped at the Mary Day's wooden hull. Overhead was every star in the heavens. I live in New York metro area. Light pollution makes stargazing impractical. But here, with Camden behind us and Land's End, England just 2,600 miles ahead, I stood mesmerized by the Big Dipper, the Belt of Orion, and I'm pretty sure Mars and Venus. Then dawn spread across Penobscot Bay. For Highbrow Magazine, I'm Mark Orwell.